Welcome back to the Rent Roll Queen podcast. I'm your host, Tarsi Taylor. Today's episode is sponsored by Rob Honeycomb, Rent Roll Broker and Agency Sales. What is and what happens during rent roll retention? Joining us today is Jeremy Streten from NPR Law and also Steve Marinucci from Marra Finance. Welcome to the show, Jeremy. Welcome to the show, Steve. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us, Tarsi.
Gentlemen, can you please introduce yourself?
So my name's Jeremy Streten. I'm a legal practice director at NPR Law, which is Northern Property and Resumption Lawyers. And I've been working in the rent roll industry for 15 years, loving doing the contracts and helping people out with their sales.
And Steve Marinucci from Marra Finance. I'm a rent roll finance specialist and started out in my business 12 months ago. And been doing rent roll financing for close to 16 years now.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So today I've called you on the show because I want to talk about a subject that is very dear to my heart, and that is all about retention. So you've gone to contract, you bought a rent roll, it's now settled, and all of a sudden we have retention. So I wanted to discuss how it looks like from a legal standpoint and also from a financier's standpoint as well. So can you guys give me some insights?
So the retention is a part of the contract. So and every contract will have a different type of retention, but essentially what it is, it's the a part of the purchase price, usually about 20%, being withheld so that if the buyer loses properties through no fault of their own, that they can claim that money back. And it's there as a stopgap in case they lose properties.
Yeah, right. So how would it work with financing? Like, what's the importance of it for a business owner?
I think the bank's concerns are going to be similar to, I guess, the purchaser's concerns, because when you go buy a rent roll, there's always going to be an element of lost properties, not necessarily from mismanagement, but there'll be properties that have been sold, over that time, which they're not getting a recurring income for. So they shouldn't really be paying for it.
Yeah.
So by the time the retention finishes, I've lost this property, we're no longer managing it. Or the landlord decides, you know what, I don't like you.
Yeah, that's right.
And I've had a couple of cases where they're like, this rent roll's been sold like 3 or 4 times. I've got different people. I'm going to go choose my own property manager.
Yes.
So there is always that risk. So that's the risk is a buyer needs to look into. But also, the banks will go, well, look, 20% is probably about it. And that would be absolute worst case you'd find. In terms of loss management through that retention period, or sometimes the landlord might say, look, you know what, I've got intention of selling this property in the next few months.
Yes.
So provided a lot of the cases, and Jeremy's probably better answering this, but depending on the contract, they can actually claim against the properties knowing that there's a definite date by when they will be moving on.
Yeah. Can you give us some more?
Yeah, so it really comes down to how the contract's drafted, what the clauses are, but that is often a way. So if a property owner wants to sell and they give the right notice, then that can be a valid claim as well under the retention.
So what are some of the biggest problems that you see with retention?
I think, firstly, is not finding out exactly why the person's left.
Yeah.
And that can be a big point of disagreement.
Yes.
Especially if the seller starts hearing rumors that maybe the buyer hasn't been managing the property the way that they would manage it. And that's a big bone of contention because everyone manages the property differently. So they get concerned about that. And so they start asking questions about, well, why are they losing all these properties? And people inevitably call them, even though they're not supposed to. And they talk to them, even though they're not supposed to. But that's one that I see all the time. And I'm often counseling sellers that we can't talk to them. And unless they're willing to put something in writing, then that's probably a valid claim. Yeah. So that's probably the biggest one that I see. Yeah. And also, a lot of the time, sellers might actually ring them and say, ring the property owner who's left and say why, and they'll tell them one story, but they'll tell the buyer something else. So that creates a problem. So really, it's around getting the right definition of why the person's left. Like, what's the reason why the person's left?
Yeah, and we need it in writing, right? Like, unless it's in writing, it doesn't exist.
So all the contracts talk about that and talk about you've got to have some sort of notice. But if someone just says, I'm leaving because I'm going to a different agency, that's a valid claim.
Yes.
There may be underlying reasons, but you may never know as a seller. And that can become one of those parts that becomes a bit of a fight, but it's never really commercial to go and fight it.
Yeah, okay. Well, the thing is, we've all seen retention go great and we've all seen retention go bad. And like you have both said, it's up to, it's mainly, 20% for 90 days, like in the contract terms. Yep. However, sometimes there are landlords with multiple properties and you will have a higher retention rate over those as well. Like could be a longer period of time.
There's always a couple of ways it goes. So like I always say that like people that are applying for finance, you can either go for a higher amount of retention for those properties or pay a lower amount. And so if you are picking up for cheaper, you're really running it's a bit of a gamble on, look, I might be buying this at $1.50 multiple because this one owner has got 10 properties. But if I keep them, great. If I don't, it's not as big of a loss. If I've managed a property for 2 years, I've made my money back, I'm okay with it. So there's two ways it be.
Yeah, and I've seen that in contracts as well, and you would have as well, where it's got your different multiples for different amount. Like, one's got like 2 to 4 properties and they've got a different multiple, 5 to 6 has got a different, and then anything higher. And then the retention, the time period could also be extended as well, 9 months or something, like 6 to 9 months, depending on how big it is. And again, it also depends, is it a residential portfolio or a commercial portfolio? Like what does that look like as well? And it's kind of all over the shop, really.
And it can be very confusing. That's where you need to make sure you understand what the contract says.
Yeah.
I think of one that you and I did together a while ago, Tarsi, where there were like 4 different types of properties.
Yeah.
There were 4 different multiples and there were 4 different retention periods.
Yeah.
And it just was a nightmare to make sure that everyone was on top of what actually needed to happen and when the retention happened. So.
Yeah, and I think it's really important too, because like you said, they're borrowing money to purchase these rent rolls. And all of a sudden, they're not actually keeping on top or having a spreadsheet to figure out what's actually left their rent roll. They're not really understanding. Then they don't have the documentation. All of a sudden, it comes to the end of the retention period and you can't get that win back for a buyer, like if it's a buyer.
Yeah. Absolutely, and they don't tell us what's going on because it's 90 days, and they're in there running their business, and that's cool. Yeah. That's what they've got to do. So I always try and check in every month or so, and just make sure that if they are losing properties, that they tell us so that we can start putting things together, or making sure they've got someone who's holding onto that material. Because otherwise, most contracts have a very strict time frame. So if it's a 90-day retention, you need to notify on the night by 5 o'clock on the 90th day. And if you don't, you can lose all your rights on the retention claim. So you don't want to be scrambling around on the 89th day trying to get emails and letters from people as to why they left. You need to have all that information well beforehand.
And we've had one we've actually had a few. We have had one recently, though, where the buyer didn't actually notify their solicitor that they had lost a property and they'd only put 1 retention claim in. There should have been 2. And they're calling us on the day after, like, hey, we need to do this. It's like, too bad, so sad.
Yeah, that's the contract says what it says, and and the reason for that is quite commercial. We need to have a definite line in the sand. We can't have people coming backwards and forwards over months. There needs to be a specific time. But what it means is the buyers just need to be on top of it.
Yes,
and they need to make sure that they understand exactly what their rights are and what their obligations are as well.
Yeah. And can I ask you, Steve, like what happens with the financing then? Like if they've lost these properties or, the buyers now got a retention claim in and say it's 5 properties, the money from that obviously gets transferred back to the buyer or the seller, like the disbursement of funds. That amount of money, does it go back to the loan or does that go back in their bank account? Like, how does it work?
It only does go back in their bank account, but there is a requirement that the banks always stipulate that it needs to go back off the loan. And it depends on, look, some banks can be a little bit more lenient with it because ultimately, over that period of time, they might have picked up another 4 or 5 properties in that period. So I would just challenge people that if they have lost a significant amount of properties and they realize that they bought a rent roll for $1 million, and it's now worth $800,000, and their debt on the rent roll is $600,000, they'll get found out eventually. They go and do a review that your rent roll's coming backwards. Where did the money go?
Yeah.
So it's definitely better. You want to pay it back off the debt because you're lowering your debt, your lending value ratio, the LVR against the rent roll.
Yes.
Because if you don't do it, and then that money will ultimately go and the debt doesn't get any smaller.
Yeah, and that's something that people really need to consider, and they really don't. I know with a lot of clients that I work with that have purchased rent rolls, I've always said, even if you're going to sell a property off that rent roll, take the money that you actually had paid for that property and put it back on your loan so that you're reducing it. And then all of a sudden, you've got a reduced loan. They're going to lend you more money and they can see you're paying it back faster. You look good. Like, there's all those things to consider.
Yeah. Unless if you're growing organically at a rate of knots, then it's definitely beneficial to be reducing your debt. If you're selling an asset, you should be paying it back.
Yeah, definitely. How, like with retention, so here's a scary one for you. What's the highest amount? Like, obviously you've got the 20%, that sits in retention. Have you ever seen it at that rate, like as in losing all of that?
I had one actually recently that wasn't one of yours, and that claim came in for about 18% of the rent roll.
Yeah, right.
We pushed back on that, and it was only, I actually don't know the percentage, but it'd be less than 10% that actually lost. Most contracts, I will say that 20% is the upper limit.
Cap rate, yeah.
In some cases, and we've done ones in the past where things might have changed, and we've actually said, well, yeah, because the circumstances of the seller have changed, we want that retention to be unlimited. The problem with that, of course, is you're not holding that retention in a trust account, and then you're trying to claim it back from someone.
Yeah.
But normally, it was about 18% that we had, and we managed to at least halve that down.
So,
in fact, we're still fighting about it now.
Oh my gosh. Terrible.
Also, the reason why that becomes a bit of a challenge, I guess, for banks is because ultimately, if that vendor has got a debt against their rent roll, they're going to they'll need to pay it back. So to release the charge that they've got against their existing business, that bank needs to be paid out. So normally if they've lent 60, 70%, that 20% should be enough to, with the 80% to fully pay out their debt, and they'll have a little bit of money left over. Generally, that money that's left over goes to the vendor after whatever the 90 days is over. But it's just important that you can't have 100% retention, because the outgoing bank isn't going to go release charge over the rent roll, without actually receiving the money.
That's right.
Yeah.
So unless if that vendor had no debt whatsoever, potentially, but that's a pretty big call.
And also from a vendor's point of view, they've built this time building this rent roll. They should, have some certainty about how much they're going to get. Yeah, and that's why I always say to them, 20% retention means that you have certainty that you're going to get 80% for the effort and and everything you've put into building that rent roll. So I think that's a fair limit to have, unless it's a really shocking rent roll that's going to have lots of holes in it.
And there are some out there like that as well.
Yeah, and the other thing to mention is what I've seen, I have never seen a rent roll go lose more than 20%.
Yeah.
What I have seen is when somebody's sold a rent roll, and they've requested new management agreements, and well and truly under 80% have come back, which means that they might have been selling 60% of the rent roll.
Yeah.
They're only paying for what they get at the time of settlement. There's another 20% retention on top of that.
Yeah, because you can have two different settlements, right? Or there's even three. Sometimes there's three settlements depending on what's actually happening in that portfolio. And then, then there's also liquidation, and if you've gone through receivership and those sorts of things. So
yeah, it's tricky.
It is. It's really tricky, but there's got to, I really feel like there's such a misunderstanding of what retention actually is and what it can actually do for you. Yeah. Can I just ask a question? On that 18%, right? And you said you got it down to 10. The other 8%, what were they claiming?
So what they were claiming was the seller, I was acting for the seller, they had a bunch of properties that were still in the old PAMB Form 28s.
Right, that's here in Queensland.
In Queensland, sorry. And so they hadn't changed them over to the Form 6s. So what I'd say to everyone is get everyone on Form 6s, because this created an ambiguity in the contract.
Yes.
Where I think that the buyer and their solicitor thought they had amended the contract to say that they didn't have to pay for those properties.
Right.
But I said they hadn't changed the contract properly. It didn't say that. They tried to do it without actually saying it.
Yeah.
And I said, well, you should have just said it. And then we would have made sure we went and got them all. So a large chunk of those were those type of properties.
Oh, that makes sense.
So they were on Form 20As. They made the claim. We said, no, they're still valid appointments. They're still able to be assigned. You have to take that. And they ended up accepting our position on, that was the majority of that we pushed back on were those ones. But I now say to any seller that I see, get the Form 6s signed. They're so much easier to assign.
Yeah.
They're a great excuse to get in contact with your property owners. You don't, obviously you don't want to be doing it all the time, as Steve said before, but if you just do it once, then you've got that touch point with the client and it's a much better result for everyone in the end.
Yeah. And let's talk about these management agreements, because seriously, like, agencies aren't fixing them up or they're not executing them correctly. And that's not just in Queensland.
Yeah.
I'm talking they're not executing them correctly in other states as well. And if you actually read your legislation correctly and thoroughly, it actually states they have to be fully executed, right? And you have to provide it to your landlords within a certain time frame as well. So it's really, really important to understand your legislation when it comes to your management agreement. But when it comes to finance, and here in Queensland, right, so we had the old PAMD, like the Property Agents and Motor Dealers Act, and then we changed over to the Property Occupations Act, which is a brand new Form 6. There are still agencies that have PAMD agreements. There's still agencies that even have them in the pre-legislation to that legislation, and the banks don't like that.
No, it's because it's there's a grey area. Like it's there are some banks who will accept it, but ultimately it's up to the solicitor who's acting for the buyer to say, well, are these actually legally valid? And can they be assignable? And what notice of assignment needs to be applied to that management agreement that is actually legally valid? Because there was an old template that I believe the REOQ had developed with the old 20As. There's currently a new one. Which one do you actually send to the client?
That's right.
Because the new one refers to the new act, whereas the previous one refers to the previous act. So there's a lot of grey areas there, but I have seen, some banks are open to funding with 20As and some aren't. So it's really important to make sure that you're upfront with that before applying for finance. And well, look, I'm buying these. I would suggest, if it was me buying a rent roll, I'd be wanting to make sure they're all Form 6s.
Well, that's all part of due diligence, right? Like, and actually understanding that rent roll correctly, not just going, oh yeah, it's got a management agreement and that's it. Well, what is the management agreement? Has it been correctly completed? Yeah. So that's really important, because I have been in the back end of one just recently where it was a bank that does not lend on PAMD agreements. And what had happened was they actually took security over the buyer's rent roll, which was all on Form 6s, but they didn't check the seller's rent roll. So they ended up buying a portfolio that had all the old agreements. I think it was like there was about 140 on the rent roll, and about 40 of those were in PAMD agreements. So now that buyer has to then go and fix all these agreements, which could have actually been fixed by the original seller. So they just created more work for themselves, which is time. Yeah. It is money. Like, that's what nobody considers when they're actually looking at what they're buying, and due diligence is a major part of that.
And let's face it, that happens because the seller, they're usually tired. That's the reason they're getting out, and they just go, I can't be bothered trying to fix this.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is get it fixed now whilst you still want to do it.
Yeah.
Because it solves so many problems in the contract negotiations, in the due diligence, and then in the retention.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're selling a house, like, you're going to fix it up and make it ready for sale. And that's why I say to people, if you're thinking of getting out next 12 to 18 months, go through your rent roll, make sure it's all squeaky clean, all your maintenance issues are up to date, your rental arrears are up to date.
Routine inspections.
Like, that needs to happen. It's exactly like selling a house or a car or anything like that. You want to make it look as good as possible to get the best return. Yeah. But look, there are instances definitely where there has to be a quick sale, and through death or or marriage splits or whatnot, where things have become a bit rushed.
Yeah.
Look, they are more the exception than the norm. But I'd strongly suggest making sure it's all crystal clean. So there is no bank has got an issue with it then.
Yeah, well, the thing is too, like, you've got to be ready for sale at any point in time, right? Because like you've just mentioned, you could get really sick and all of a sudden you've got a fire sale, and I call those renovators delights because you've never actually gone through and fixed it. But not only that, they're actually missing out on income because they haven't actually fixed up like their portfolio. They're not checking everything, and they could have been earning more off that portfolio during the actual running of their business, which would have actually increased also their sale price. So, and then you got retention, and all of a sudden here we are in retention period, And then you're losing properties because you've mismanaged and they've gone to another agency and they don't really like the other agency and things like that. So it's really important. And then the buyers get really disgruntled.
Yeah.
Because they've actually paid money and money's sitting in a bank account. This is another thing people don't really understand. That 20% that sits in a trust account for the 90 days or more is earning interest. So it's really important that if you know that one of those properties, say, is going to be sold, you know, they've already given you notice, and it's recently happened where we've seen it, that the actual buyer knows that they don't have to pay for that property because that money's going to sit in a trust account. They've had to pay stamp duty on it. They've got to pay interest on it.
That's right.
And all of a sudden, it's costing them money.
Exactly.
So they're things that are important. What else do you guys see when it comes to retention? Like I'm sure you got stories for days.
We could be here for hours. What I'd say on that is if you've got a concern, make sure you raise it, as part of the due diligence or part of the contract negotiation.
Yeah.
The one I was saying before, that the buyer tried to be clever.
Right.
Right. They tried to be clever, and they just weren't upfront about it. If that was their concern, they should have raised that, right? And things can happen in that time period, especially with the length of time some of the contracts they do go on for a bit of time. Things can be fixed, and so just be upfront and say, if I don't, if there's a bunch of Form 28s and you don't want those, say that. Yeah. Make sure that everyone knows, because if everyone's communicating, everyone's talking, things get resolved. Most of the fights that I see as a lawyer are because people didn't talk.
Yeah, right.
I'm not a family lawyer, but that's a
don't worry.
It's a whole other area. But even in commercial contracts, all the time, if people just talked and said what they really wanted, so many fights, so many disputes would be resolved before they even came before anyone. So the big thing for me is, if you've got a concern, make sure it's addressed and it's put up front and everyone's talking about it.
And I'm going to say this really open and honestly, like, if nothing's a dumb question. So if you've got a question, ask your broker, ask your solicitor. That's part of your A team, right? Like, this is your A team. So ask the dumb questions that you think are dumb. Actually, no question's dumb. Put it aside. It's just your ego thinking it. And get the clarification that you actually need, and keep asking and digging. So like you said, everything's then in the contract.
Yeah.
Because that's black and white.
That's right. And if you've disclosed everything, then there can be no dispute. It's all there. So, I think it's just that I wish I could tattoo the word communication on my forehead sometime. I sometimes feel like that. But it would solve so many problems. So,
And even from a financier's point of view, I'm pretty sure they would love to see a really black and white contract there's no real grey area in it.
Exactly. So that's but most of them are. And I think the industry and rent rolls do transact quite a bit. So, but the one thing I find is making sure you're engaging a lawyer who gets it.
Yes.
That is the biggest challenge. The amount of times I've seen things blow up, the lawyers that are acting for the buyer or seller, if they haven't done a rent roll contract before, and they're not familiar with what to look out for, it's that's where the biggest issues happen. Yeah. And I think even for myself, from a financing perspective, you're dealing with a banker who may only do one rent roll transaction a year. Right. They don't know what the risks are in a transaction, what to look out for. Yeah, it's very, very similar.
Yeah, I've just seen a contract actually, and I can already tell it was a solicitor who has never really dealt with it. It was very vague, extremely vague. I could see there was very little protection for both seller and buyer within that actual contract. Yep. And that's the one where all these 20As were actually found. So it's really important to work with specialists in our industry and not be with a generalist, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on the show, guys. I really, really appreciate your insights. And I will put all your details in the caption for both of you. And anyone who's looking for rent roll finance, to reach out to Steve, and anyone who's looking for contract requirements, to reach out to Jeremy.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, Tarsi.